Call of the quorum be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I come to the Senate floor today, as I have virtually every day since we've been back in session, to address what is perhaps the most critical question facing this nation: how to rein in the out-of-control federal spending that threatens to bankrupt the country and saddle future generations with a burden of debt that will dramatically reduce the quality of their lives. Yesterday morning on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, Senate Majority Leader Reid claimed, and I quote, "The American people need to understand that it's not as if we've done nothing for the debt." Mr. President, I would argue that the American people do understand, but what they disagree with is the Majority Leader's statement that we've done nothing for the debt, to reduce the debt that we are accumulating at a record rate. We all know that we are spending nearly $40,000 a second of taxpayer money. We know that it's been now 1,377 days since we have passed a budget in the United States Senate, or one has even been offered up by the Democrat leadership. Our debt continues to accumulate and now stands at nearly $16.5 trillion. And anybody who looks at that debt clock sees that the numbers are rotating faster than the eye can see. So no, I don't agree. I don't think we've done much to address our debt. And rather than recognize the real problem of our debt, which is spending, the Majority Leader talked about the need for yet more taxes and yet higher revenues. For all the debate about making the wealthy pay more in order to pay down our debt, the fiscal cliff deal barely changed the nation's long-term fiscal outlook, particularly if spending continues on its present course. A report from the Pete Peterson Foundation released this week puts U.S. debt on a track to reach 200% of gross domestic product by 2040. Now, keep in mind that many economists, respected economists not with a partisan issue to promote here, those that have looked at this impartially have said to us that historically, without exception, once a nation's debt reaches 90% of GDP, it becomes very damaging to the economy, and something I believe we are experiencing now, the early phases of that. So 200% of GDP, if we stay on the present course, will take this country down. It'll take our economy down. It'll take our ability to provide needed and necessary functions of the federal government. The plain fact is that our debt is going to continue to spiral upwards until Washington tackles its spending addiction. Now, the President and some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are claiming that in the last few years they've already cut the budget to the bone. These so-called savings they talk about are savings that are anticipated by drawdowns in Afghanistan and Iraq that are already set to wind down. So we can't just simply say, well, we've solved the problem here because we are now going to take this money which we anticipate we won't have to spend, and by the way, that assumes there will be no more overseas contingent operations that will have to take place in the next 10 years. If we look at what's happening around the world, if we look at the threats to instability that's happening around the world, it's pretty hard to assume that we simply don't need to spend any money or won't need to over the next 10 years to address something that's of a direct threat to the United Nations in the United States. Well, all of this basically says it's pretty hard to take seriously the suggestion by the Majority Leader and the President that we've done our job in cutting spending to reduce the debt. Now, if I were able to take the time and have the time to list the wasteful catalog of the duplicative spending and wasteful spending of the taxpayer dollars on this floor, I would use up the rest of the day and more. But let me just mention a few examples that my colleague from Oklahoma, Senator Coburn, who I think has done this body a great service and the American public a great service by delineating and outlining some of these unnecessary spending of taxpayer dollars and giving us a route and a road and a roadmap and a pathway to addressing unneeded, wasteful spending of tax dollars, particularly at a time when we're having to borrow nearly 40% or more in order to keep our government functioning. Now, these are not just out of some right-wing organization sitting there trying to embarrass the Congress. These issues that and this spending that Senator Coburn has listed, it comes out of official government reports, the General Accounting Office, the Congressional Research Service, and other government entities. These have been documented by our own official national government agencies. $1.6 billion spent annually to maintain unneeded federal property. If it's unneeded, why do we have to maintain it year after year at the cost of $1.6 trillion? Let's put a for sale sign up there and receive some revenue from these assets that are documented as being unneeded. Another $1.6 billion spent by the federal government to provide free cell phone service. Now, the Congress has passed legislation for certain categories of low-income people to receive free cell phones. Whether you're for that or against that or voted for it or voted against it, whatever, what has been laid out here is the fact that many of these phones are going to people who don't qualify for this handout, and hundreds of thousands of those go to people who already have at least one phone. Offer somebody a free second phone, they're going to grab it. But do they need it? And does the taxpayer have to pay for it? $15 million of taxpayer money went to the IRS for a public relations effort to try to improve its image with taxpayers. Good luck with that PR program. I think we know where people stand regarding their opinion of the IRS. And is this really a necessary expenditure? The IRS sent a prisoner who filed a bogus tax return a refund check for $327,456. And they even sent it to the correctional facility. You'd think somewhere along the line somebody would say, maybe we ought to look into this. Now, hopefully, we'll be able to get this one back, along with the $30,000 that was sent to the jail where a murderer collected $30,000 in claimed unemployment benefits. Well, yes, he was unemployed, but that's not exactly what our unemployment system is designed to do. Now, while we're going after that other $327,000, maybe we can collect this $30,000 on the way. Every day we hear of reports of food stamps being used to pay for beer, cigarettes, cell phone bills, and even cars. That hardly needs to be mentioned because it's just something we've come to understand is a lot of misuse of those tax dollars. On and on it goes, and I could list more and more. Senator Coburn just the other day listed some duplicative programs that he thought, well, maybe we don't need multiple numbers of these, maybe we can consolidate. We have 18 domestic food assistance programs, 45 separate job training programs, and I love this one, my personal favorite, more than 50 financial literacy programs provided by the federal government. The first question we need to ask is, what does the federal government have to say about literacy, given our current financial situation? Hopefully, they're using its own dysfunction as an example of what not to do. So these outrageous spending items and duplicative federal programs are not isolated examples. Just a few weeks ago, the Treasury Department issued its year-end report for fiscal 2012. One of the bombshells in this report that has received virtually no coverage or commentary is the estimate by the Government Accounting Office that $108 billion was lost to improper payments by the federal government. $108 billion. And since over 1/3 of all federal spending wasn't even examined yet by the GAO, the total amount lost is going to be obviously much higher. And the fact that this escaped the notice of much of the media and many of my colleagues is very telling. Unfortunately, we are getting so used to the notion of inefficient and wasteful federal spending, a government report verifying over $100 billion in waste, fraud, and abuse doesn't even register. So when my colleagues come down to offer amendments and are voted down, amendments to offset spending for new programs such as disaster relief, and a cacophony of rejection comes their way for saying, how dare you think about even trying to offset this? You're taking money away from babies and children and mothers and essential functions of the federal government. And then you start to read down the list of wasteful spending and duplicative programs and say, you can't come up with a dime to offset needed expenses? And let me just say that we're not here to undermine or destroy the necessary function of running an efficient government, but the key word is efficient. We want to spend taxpayers' dollars in a way that taxpayers understand we're doing the best with their hard-earned dollars to spend it on essential programs. I have suggested in the Appropriations Committee that each program that we appropriate money for be put through a system of what I call triage, that we ask each agency before they present their budget to us annually for the appropriation to pay for their expenses and distributions, that they first address this question: is this an essential function of the federal government? Is this a function that we might like to do but can no longer afford to do? And separate that from those that we no longer need or never should have been put there in the first place. At a time when we are suffering from plunge into a deficit spending and debt, should we not at least apply some standards and some principles in terms of where and how we allocate funds that are sent to us by the taxpayer? I've asked each agency to do that. We haven't received any reports back. All we hear is from a number of voices around town, oh no, we can't touch any of this. Every dime that we spend is absolutely necessary. Well, I think what Senator Coburn has done and begun to do, and what I hope to do, and also work with him and others, is to identify some of those areas and literally ask the question to my colleagues and to the American people. Do you think this is really an essential function of the federal government? Is this something that maybe we would like to do but don't have the money to do? Or is this something that, frankly, has just not lived up to its promise, is wasting money, or is this something that never should have been passed in the first place? If we don't apply those principles to our future spending, we're going to continue down this road. Now, we all know that the big three, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, have to be reformed to save the programs, but have to be reformed because they are unsustainable in their current form. And I'll be talking much more about that later. But what I do want to acknowledge here today is the fact that without getting to those programs, which we have to do if we're going to solve our long-term problem, we also need to seriously look at how we spend money on all the discretionary spending that comes before this particular body. And we have to look at those things that simply don't measure up in terms of a responsible way of handling our taxpayer revenues. So, Mr. President, I'm going to continue coming to this floor. I'm going to continue to keep pointing out areas where I think we can save money and continuing to make the case that this Congress has not begun to do the job it needs to do in terms of dealing with our spending. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.